you all for coming. It's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Jonathan Alexander. Jonathan received his BA and his PhD in comparative literature at Louisiana State University. He taught first at the University of Southern Colorado, then the University of Cincinnati, and he is now professor of English at UC Irvine, where he is also chair of women's studies, was for 4 years the director of the first-year writing program, and currently serves as the campus writing coordinator and the founding director of the UCI Center for Excellence in Writing and Communication. The UCI thing is always very hard for me. I always think for Adam, for Nasser, the UCI, UIC. As befits someone with a wide range of interests, his dissertation was on Whitman, Rimbaud, and Hopkins. And was actually directed by a person whose work I always admired very much when I was in graduate school, a guy called James Olney, who I sort of hadn't thought of for years, but a very sort of also versatile and kind of impressive scholar. As befits someone with such a wide range of interests, he has also written in a wide range of genres. In addition to his scholarship, he's published many poems, at least one novelette, and I won't mention, because I don't quite understand, the various multimedia installations he's also produced. He's also written on a wide range of topics, from California science fiction to Shakespeare manga, to computer games, to bisexuality and queer theory. In fact, a collection he edited, into which he contributed, was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award in 2011. And I was thinking as I was coming to school this morning, we have probably the highest concentration of Lambda Literary Award nominees ever assembled in one room, except at the actual award ceremony themselves. Right now, since Jonathan has been nominated, it was 2011, but in our own department, Marianne Mohenraj has been nominated this year. Laura Krugoff, I'm not sure if Laura is here, but Laura Krugoff, who's of course a graduate student about to be leaving our department last, well not last, she did a nice job. Also nominated one. And Peter Coviello, who's here because he just can't get enough of going to job talks. For one of these. So it's kind of a distinct pleasure to be surrounded by Lambda nominees. I should add also that in addition to the Lambda nomination, Jonathan won the Charles Moran Award for distinguished contribution to the field of computers and composition, a topic on which he has published often, as, for example, exemplified by his book, Digital Youth, Emerging Literacies on the World Wide Web. Among his many other publications, I'll simply mention ones that are directly on composition. They include Multimodality, New Media and Composition Studies, co-written with Jacqueline Rhodes, forthcoming in 2014.
3 days.
Yeah, okay. That's totally good. Understanding Rhetoric, A Graphic Guide to Composition with Elizabeth Lush, which came out, like 3 years ago.
Last year.
Literacy, Sexuality, Pedagogy, Theory and Practice for Composition Studies, which came out a long, long time ago in 2008. Finally, Professor Alexander is not only a member of the Executive Committee of the Conference on College Composition and Communication, so when I typed out that sentence yesterday, I had a sudden revelation, which was that's what 4 C's means. All these years, people are talking about going to 4 C's, and just see some of the 4 C's, and I always thought I know what it named, but I had no idea. It was a Conference on College Composition and Communication. In addition to being a member of the Executive Committee, he has also recently been appointed the editor of College Composition and Communication. His topic for today's talk is Literacy's Hunger Games, Corporate Sponsorship of Young Adult Fiction and Media Literacy. So would you join me in welcoming Professor Alexander.
I really appreciate that. People have been very kind and generous so far, and I hope to provoke some of your less generous commentary in the next hour as I invite you to help me think through this new project. We're going to begin at kind of an odd spot, or maybe not, Harry Potter. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Harry Potter. Seen any of the films? Any of the books? I'm going to confess something right away. When I first started to try to read some of these books in the late 90s, I hated them. I think I still do. I don't know that they're particularly good books, and I hope that doesn't jaundice any of you against my talk so soon. But I have to admit, I was very skeptical when I first started reading them. I had read a lot of genre fiction, had been involved in thinking a lot about genre, popular culture, and so I was course, very curious and tracked this phenomenon as it arose in the late 90s and throughout the early 2000s. And wasn't really fully on board with the importance of the significance of what was happening with something like Harry Potter until I found myself on vacation in London outside of Piccadilly Circus. It used to be a large Waterstones bookstore in Piccadilly Circus. 7 stories of books. It's extraordinary. And we happened to be there the night that the 5th Harry Potter book was going to be released. And my partner is very interested in Harry Potter and liked the books, and so we said, well, let's get in the line. So we went out to eat in Soho and wandered over about 11 p.m. to the Waterstones to get in line, and that line was already 12 blocks long. And so it took us the next couple of hours to actually get the book. And then I realized that even if I couldn't enjoy the first Harry Potter book, I was missing out as a literacy studies scholar, as a writing teacher, somebody who works in rhetoric and composition, I was missing out by not paying attention to this phenomenon. That what I was witnessing was a literacy event, and people were willing to stand in line for a 600-page book. Young people willing to stand in line for a 600-page book, a book they would then devour in the next 24 to 48 hours and begin themselves to write about. So that began my real fascination with young adult fiction. There's a set of literacy encounters and practices, but also as a corporate investment. And that's what I really want to talk about. You now know Hunger Games. Hunger Games actually produced by the Scholastic Corporation, the American publishers of the Harry Potter series. And it's hard for me not to think about the Hunger Games, a book, now a set of movies, some online games, a set of websites, whole panoply of media interventions. Hard for me not to kind of track Hunger Games as the Scholastic Corporation, having witnessed the extraordinary success of the Harry Potter books turned into films, and wondering, can we do that again? And I think that they did it. And in fact, as I'll talk about Hunger Games in just a little bit, I understand Hunger Games primarily as the Scholastic Corporation, trying not only to create another successful series of books that could immediately be turned into films and other sort of monetizable producting, but also as its own commentary on the evolutionary state and the ever-evolving state of literacy practices by young people in the country, if not in fact, the global north. And indeed, media ecologies is something I'm particularly interested in, because the book is never just the book anymore. So many books, particularly almost all books marketed towards young people today, are marketed as large media ecologies, as the book, but also as merchandise, trinkets, and other things that can be bought and consumed. Some of you might have seen Capital Couture, which is a set of little baubles and trinkets and necklaces and wristbands and whatnot that are designed to emulate the kinds of baubles that people and jewelry that people in the Hunger Games capital wear. So this is yet another way in which the books are monetized, but also more participatory culture products such as fan fiction, people who actually will take up someone else's intellectual property, write alternative stories based on characters that they like to spend time with. The Scholastic Corporation and other publishers and purveyors of young adult fiction are very attuned to this. They're attuned to the kind of inter-imbrication of media and kind of narrative across multiple platforms, so much so that they're beginning to craft books that won't just be made into films, but books themselves that trigger electronic media. So some of you might have seen Patrick Harmon's Skeleton Creek. If you have kids, maybe a 10-year-old child, you might know the Skeleton Creek books. These are books that have now, they're not just textual products, but that have online content that readers are encouraged to access as they read the book to get additional clues, not only about the plot, but also additional information about the characters. I think one of the most compelling versions of this is Tony Dieterlitz's The Search for Wondla, which is a loose readaptation of The Wizard of Oz. But what Dieterlitz does is, he crafts his book so that periodically in it are small icons. And if you've downloaded the right program onto your computer, you hold the book up to your computer's camera, and the icon triggers puzzles and games and all sorts of maps, so that in a way, the book itself, the material object, interfaces directly with a piece of software to invite you and usher you into a whole other virtual landscape. So this is the deep connectivity that publishers are now imagining between traditional print media and online multi-mediated platforms. Now, there are a lot of ways to understand this. If I were to be doggedly neo-Marxist and pay a lot more attention to Adorno and Horkheimer and the culture industry, I might pay attention particularly to this. Notice Hunger Games and its various spin-offs by other publishers, Divergent, Matched, Legend. There is certainly an attempt to capitalize on the attention economy here. We know Hunger Games was such a huge success. It in some ways has spawned other publishers to promote different kinds of books that are themselves dystopic, centered around primary female protagonist who has to try to figure out how to save the world from fascism while also being torn between two different love interests and simultaneously learning how to kick the crap out of everybody around her. I have just essentially described all 4 of these books. And if you notice, even the way that they are marketed, there is not only a repetition of plot that Adorno and Horkheimer were particularly interested in tracking, how the popular media might replicate particular plots that are monetizable, and that could potentially even induce passivity, but even in the actual structure of the books covers themselves. These are books that are designed to catch attention. If you like Hunger Games, look at Divergent. Almost itself an immediate visual riff of Hunger Games into Matched and Legend. But at the same time, people such as Janice F. Bradway pointed out a long time ago that commodities like these mass-produced literary texts are selected, purchased, constructed, and used by real people with previously existing needs, desires, intentions, and interpretive strategies. And in media studies, this has always been kind of the great divide. To what extent do media products sort of exist as consumable goods that potentially are just pacifying a populace versus Bradway's 20-year-old formulation, which is people use these things, they can reuse them, they can remix them, they pick them up, and then they become part of not necessarily the mass media's ecology, but part of more individuated or more local and collective ecologies, and do work for people. So participatory culture is the phrase that we often use to describe the evolution of fan communities. Prosumers, people that don't just consume content, but pick it up and do things with it. People who remix, create their own content based on other people's content, so much so that Henry Jenkins calls this now spreadable media, so that media and story spreads over multiple venues and is out of the control of large corporations. Nerd Fighters might be an example of this. How many of you know what Nerd Fighters is? I'll be very impressed now. There's always a couple. There are always a couple of Nerd Fighters in the room. Nerd Fighters is wonderful. This was invented by John Green and his brother Tom Green. John Green may be one of the most important of the young adult fiction writers who I'm going to talk about in a moment. But this is the whole point here is to encourage young people to create their own media and to talk about the things that they do in the real world, particularly to talk about the good works that they do in the good world, and how can they come together collectively to create a place where nerds gather and play. We fight to increase awesome, and I love this, decrease suck. So that is the whole notion of Nerd Fighters. It's to use media technologies to document and create an archive of how young people are attempting to decrease suck. And that usually means how they are fighting the power, questioning authority, doing good deeds, promoting collective and social good interests. So that's an example. We'll come back to that in a moment. This sort of wealth of participatory culture has necessitated that we think, and that corporate producers think more about how their works get out into the public. So Henry Jenkins has famously formulated that advertisers, people who are responsible, for instance, for advertising something like the Hunger Games, not just advertising it, but actually creating it and disseminating it, they have to create texts that people actively seek out and willingly circulate. That if in an attention-impoverished economy, your attention is the most important thing that someone can grab a hold of and maintain, that the text that we are able to put in your hands that you will then pick up and do something with is going to be the most successful text. because it's one that will continue to circulate. It's one that will continue to potentially make money for the corporation. And people who study young adult fiction have been aware of this. They call it transmedia. Michael Cart, one of the foremost historians of young adult fiction, says that the goal in this still burgeoning field of YA fiction is to create an instantly recognizable brand or franchise that can be spun off into a variety of economic opportunities, books, TV series, movies, products, and then promoted through interactive websites, contests, and social networks. You can think of the Harry Potter Alliance as perhaps one of the most successful instantiations of this. How many of you know? Sorry that the screen is a little odd, but we'll figure it out later. The Harry Potter website, you can just go to it, Harry Potter Alliance, thehpalliance.org, is a site that brings together people who have formed their own Harry Potter groups, Harry Potter Alliance groups, generally at high schools, sometimes at middle schools, in community organizations. And the focus of these groups is to promote the positive values of magic in contemporary society. And so people in a high school or a middle school group, for instance, will talk about the books, but then they will also document. They'll send in videos or make blog posts about how they have, as the Harry Potter Alliance in their local school, have created an anti-bullying campaign as a kind of real-world magic that's going on right now. To stop bullying because, Harry was bullied, and it's obviously a bad thing. I am not knocking this. I think this is wonderful work in many ways. This is also the Scholastic Corporation's wet dream, because what it does is it takes that brand, the Harry Potter brand, and it is remixable and deployable throughout a range of venues and possible forms of uptake that even the Scholastic Corporation itself could not have imagined. And so what gives spread the Harry Potter brand again and again, and it introduces whole new generations of readers to Harry Potter and continues to reap profits for Scholastic. So as a literacy scholar, there are a lot of ways that I can think about this. One of the ways is through Deborah Brandt's notion of literacy sponsorship. And basically what she suggests in a powerful book called Literacy in American Lives is that it is in the vested interest of certain groups, and groups could be anything, from a corporation to a church, to the Department of Education, to a Department of English. It's in the vested interest of a group to sponsor certain kinds of literacy practices. And in fact, literacy education, learning to write, learning to communicate, is often the focus of many different kinds of pressure points, many different pressures. The business community, for instance, is always telling me about the kinds of things that I should be teaching my students how to write so that I can create better cogs to fit into their wheels. So, a little bit of critique there. But there are also lots of pressures internally. The university wants certain kinds of work to be done in writing courses. The students themselves bring pressure to bear on certain sorts of literacy practices. So understanding what literacy is and how literacy functions is perhaps best understood in some ways by those people who are actively sponsoring it and are trying to ask us to make sure that people are literate and to invite people to be literate in particular ways. So we can understand literacy then as a form of identity formation. What are the kinds of pressures that I face myself to be literate in particular ways, and how does that impact how I understand myself, how I move in the world, what I do? We can also understand literacy in terms of young adult fiction as a commodity, right? I'm learning to read in order so that I can I can purchase this particular book and do things with it. And I might do things with literacy. I might behave in particular ways that promote the consumption of these particular books. But I also want to think about literacy as a kind of potential brand. And there are many ways to brand literate acts. And so my current project is focused primarily on that kind of movement. How are different sponsors of literate practice trying to brand particular literate acts or particular notions about literacy? And so I'm drawing in part on Adam Arvidsson's work on brand management. And Arvidsson is one of the foremost neo-Marxist critics thinking about branding in contemporary corporate cultures, and not just in corporate cultures, but brands as they permeate our culture and help people form community and impact identity. Arvidsson suggests that contemporary brand management contains two sets of techniques. One set aims at the commodification of the autonomous productivity of consumers as it unfolds naturally in its social environment. And he thinks that cruel hinting and viral marketing address particularly productive and culturally mobile consumers. But another set of techniques aims at anticipating and programming the productivity of consumers and guiding it in particular directions. And so we can think of Harry Potter, for instance, right, as as one of Scholastic's more prominent brands, in that people pick up these books, they read them for pleasure, right? But then, in many ways, they begin to act on them. They create school skits, they create fan fiction, they create chapters of the Harry Potter Alliance. And so that's not just the commodification of autonomous productivity of consumers, but it's also mobilizing and programming the productivity of consumers in particular ways. But that's my question, which is an entity like the Scholastic Corporation capable of programming productivity? Can it guide consumption, and not just consumption, but prosumption, the creation of texts? Can it guide literary acts in particular ways? And what I'm going to argue is that I think that it tries, and that there are implications for literacy education when a corporation like the Scholastic Corporation attempts to do that. Finally, from Arvidsson, the point that I'm going to most pull from is contained in this passage. He says, as a sort of virtual real estate, brands occupy a valuable position in the life world, or to use marketing terminology, the minds of consumers. The position is valuable insofar as it enables a brand to subsume and appropriate what consumers do with the brand in mind as source of surplus value and profits. Consequently, brands work as a kind of ubiquitous managerial device by means of which everyday life is managed, or perhaps better programmed, so that it evolves in ways that can potentially generate the right kind of attention and hence brand value. And that's basically my question. To what extent is it possible and even desirable for a corporation such as the Scholastic Corporation to guide and direct via branding particular kinds of literacy, the literary practices of young people today? The Scholastic Corporation, in case you don't know, has been around since the 1920s. Some of you, if you're of my generation, you will remember the little reader, the weekly reader, and filling out forms to get books. You'd send away on this cheesy newsprint checked boxes of books that you want, and then maybe 2 weeks later, the books would appear magically on the teacher's desk, usually wrapped up with or bound with a rubber band. And I realized upon reflection that Scholastic Corporation was absolutely instrumental in helping me to fetishize the book as a consumable product. Because we would check off the things that we desired, and then they would arrive in the mail. We couldn't wait to get our hands on those books. I think the Scholastic Corporation's aims are much more interesting and refined right now, and I want to talk a little bit about that. First, a video. This is from the Scholastic Corporation's Right to Read campaign. Let's see if I can get over to it.
Today we live in a world full of digital information.
I'm going to figure out how to, there we go. Get to that.
Yet reading has never been more important because we know that for young people, the ability to read is the door opener to holding a job, to understanding their world, and to knowing themselves. Here is what we believe about reading in the second decade of the 21st century. We call this the Reading Bill of Rights.
We believe that literacy, the ability to read, write, and understand, is the birthright of every child in the world,
as well as the pathway to succeed in school and to realize a complete life.
Young people need to read nonfiction for information to understand their world.
And literature for imagination to understand themselves.
We believe that the massive amounts of digital information and images now transmitted daily
Make it even more important for a young person to know how to analyze, interpret, and understand information.
Separate fact from opinion.
and to have deep respect for logical thinking.
We believe that literature and drama, whether on printed pages,
Screens, on stage or film,
help young people experience the great stories of emotion and action, leading to a deeper understanding of what it means to be truly human.
without this literacy heritage, life lacks meaning
Coherence.
and soul.
we believe that every child has a right to a textual lineage.
A reading and writing autobiography which shows that who you are is in part developed through the stories and information you've experienced.
This textual lineage will enable all young people to have a reading and writing identity.
Which helps them understand who they are and how they can make their lives better. In short, you are what you read.
We might stop it right there, and I encourage you to finish watching it. It proceeds in much the same way. On one hand, great, the right to read, really important, and the Reading Bill of Rights may be one way to conceptualize that, but I worry about that conceptualization. my mind, this is a very neoliberal approach to reading. It's a way to identify the individual reader as somebody who needs access to that world of information, but to do what with it? Throughout the video, the emphasis is on, well, you know, to survive in the world today, to be able to get the kind of preparation that you need for a job in today's economy. And so that's about the extent. At one point in the video, the panoply of faces argued that it's not just important that the individual learn to read, but that the individual also be able to buy books. That's obviously part of the story of the Scholastic Corporation. But what's also interesting about it is how reading is a highly individuated and job preparatory set of skills, right, or modality that the Scholastic Corporation is forwarding. And I kept wondering, well, what's at stake there? And then I realized, well, of course, this is not that far different from the current Common Core. And if your state, like mine, has adopted the Common Core, there are many very good things in it, but then when you begin to really read carefully about how the Common Core positions reading and writing, then you see some interesting overlap and some parallels with the Scholastic Corporation's sponsorship of reading. Common Core, for instance, and these will be the guidelines, the sort of standards or guidelines for K through 12 education in the public sphere. Students must be immersed in information. And it was almost, in my mind, a quotation from or at least resonance with the students' right to read video. Immersed in information about the world around them if they are to develop a strong general knowledge of the vocabulary they need to become successful readers and be prepared for college, career, and life. Informational texts play an important part in building students' content knowledge. Further, it is vital for students to have extensive opportunities to build knowledge through text so that they can learn independently. And again, on first blush, this does not necessarily seem bad. But what I'm arguing ultimately is that this is a kind of branding of literate behavior that positions people within that information immersion, right? We are surrounded by information. We need to figure out how to navigate it. And essentially what people are, they're purveyors of content. That they're funnels for information. There is very little talk in any of this language, right, about young people as generators of knowledge or as collective participants in knowledge construction. They can get knowledge and vocabulary to become successful readers and be prepared, right? They can build content knowledge. Here we get a glimmer. Vital for students to have extensive opportunities to build knowledge through text so they can learn independently. That is something which is often sidelined throughout many of these documents and rarely actually overtly talked about. People are purveyors of content. They buy the book and pass it on. Are they generators of content? So back to Arvidson quickly. I would argue that there is a sort of ambiance building around the Scholastic Corporation and around the current Common Core, which highlights literacy as that kind of commodity that is also a brand in that it helps people manage this world of information, and because it situates themselves and helps them understand themselves as purveyors of information. They have to learn to navigate all that information. Very little talk about young people as content producers, which I think is interesting. How does this play itself out? Quickly, back to the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games, how many of you have read and or seen one of the Hunger Games films? Read the book or seen the film? So I'm not going to go on at length about that particular narrative. Basically, a young gal gets recruited to help fight the forces of fascism, right? It's a sort of revolutionary, has a lot of revolutionary spirit against the capital, the sort of fascist dictatorship situated in Colorado. It's curious. But it's also a book that is a media literacy narrative itself. Because the entire trilogy, and the films are bearing this out, is really not just about how Katniss Everdeen comes to learn how to fight the power. It's how she comes to learn to manipulate media in order to fight the power. And you might remember there's one startling scene in the first film. I thought the film was beautiful in this regard, in which she realizes that while everything she's doing is being filmed, while she's in this terrible, terrible game space and being attacked on all sides, she can, through hand gestures, manipulate audience emotion and help to support the nascent revolution that is building against the Capitol. The books continue to play this out, and in fact, the third book, if you've read it, Mockingjay, really is, I think, a powerful text all about media control and domination through media. Early on in the book, in the first book, Hunger Games, her mentor, Haymitch, grabs her shoulder and pins her against the wall saying, "Who cares, it's all a big show." It's all how you're perceived. So what her mentor is already trying to indoctrinate Katniss into recognizing she lives in a world much like the readers of this book live in a world, in which they are not only under constant surveillance, but that the media saturates and it conditions how it is that we understand ourselves. So much so that Katniss begins to worry, what is real, what is authentic? Is there anything necessarily real or authentic in this world? The answer ultimately is no. By the time we get to the final book, Katniss is narrating to us, the next afternoon we're notified that the whole squad is needed to stage a fairly complicated propo or propaganda film. Katniss and her friends have been conscripted into just creating propaganda films that they aim not only at their own troops, but that they aim at the Capitol's troops to kind of dispirit them. Pete has been right about one thing. Coin and Plutarch are unhappy with the quality of footage they're getting from the Star Squad. Very dull, very uninspiring. The obvious response is that they never let us do anything but play after their guns. However, this is not about defending ourselves. It's about coming up with a usable product. And so what's so interesting for me is that on one hand, I really want to read the whole Hunger Games trilogy as this complex, perhaps even partially unconscious reflection on behalf of the Scholastic Corporation about its own relationship with media and what it learned in shepherding Harry Potter to such tremendous success in this country, is the creation of products and the marketing of these products to young people and the marketing of the products through young people. Because that's ultimately what Hunger Games is about. This is a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read through to Mockingjay. So cover your ears if you don't want to know. But what's ultimately revealed about Hunger Games, about this particular narrative of media literacy, is that Katniss, while she is busy trying to become her own star and trying to help use her marketability as a figure of the revolution, is herself being used. She was not only being used initially by the Capitol in its ploy in the broadcasting of the Hunger Games, she's being used by the rebellion itself, which is ultimately revealed to be no better than the fascist Capitol dictators. And so by the end of the entire trilogy, she and Peeta essentially retreat to tend a garden in this sort of twisted, Candide-like move, in which the best that they could do is just cultivate their own, literally, their own garden. They had to leave everything else behind. It's almost as though that the lesson that one is getting from having read through the Hunger Games is that you can try to manipulate. You can try to manipulate back. You can try to take control. You can do it yourself. You can try to participate. But there are always going to be layers upon layers, people using you, people remixing your remix, people co-opting what you do. It is the story, right, of generative capitalism, the story of a capitalism that itself learns to monetize the counterculture and revolutionary spirit. So it's as though that's what the books ultimately, that is the ambiance, that is the brand of literate behavior that the books are marketing. We see this in some other books as well. TMI, for those of you not in the digital know, means too much information. It's a book series by Patty Blount. And you can kind of even see here, one post will change everything. Be careful what it is that you post online. And in fact, in so many young adult fictions, the dominant threat of interactive media, of multimedia, of the internet is played out again and again and again, almost as though there was some sort of sense that working with multimedia is ultimately just going to be dangerous, and you want to be very, very careful. Not a bad idea necessarily. There is certainly bullying. There is cyberbullying. People are taking advantage of online. And yet, I think that there is, within young adult fiction, this larger ambiance that brands multimedia behavior as dangerous, as difficult. Now, I said before that I'm really interested in participatory culture, how young people pick up these things, right? And I still believe that some of the most interesting things that happen are how young people pick up different bits of the culture industry and its products and try to reuse them and make different meaning of them. And I think that part of my project is not just a deep analysis of these particular books as products of corporate cultures, as branding particular kinds of literacy, but also the uptake. What do people do with them? And so one whole thread of work that I am researching is the student-generated trailer. And these are all over YouTube. So if you were to even just go to YouTube and type in Hunger Games trailer, you would find not only the trailers that the film company has produced for its product, but you would find tons and tons of small videos that young people have made, sometimes as part of regular content, often on their own, in which they're imagining what their movie version of the Hunger Games would be like. And so students do a lot of this. Young people do a lot of this for their favorite books. And there are whole sets of books that haven't been made into films yet, that young people will imagine the movie version. They will get together with their friends. They will script it out, and they will write the trailer version for their movie version. This is one of them, about the Hunger Games. I like the sound effects.
Welcome, welcome. Time has come to select one courageous man or woman to participate in the 74th Hunger Games. Primrose Everdeen. I volunteer! I volunteer! I volunteer! I volunteer!
These things are often full of a little bit of overacting, as you can tell. But they're really delightful. And so there's a lot of this narrative build-up in many of the shows, of the little trailers.
24 of us go in, and only one comes out. I just wish there was a way I could show them that they don't own me. If I'm gonna die, I just want to do myself. I can't afford to think like that.
Now, I'm going to go and stop it right here. You just have to trust me. The rest of the trailer, which goes on for about another minute, is just this vast fight scene rolling around in the mountain. But I think it's really interesting that of all of the things that these young people decided to film, obviously they're going to film the action, right? They're going to film some bits of action. They're going to film the initial setup, right, where Katniss and Peeta are being chosen. But then right in the middle of this video, and it is squarely in the middle of the video, is that one little scene which is so crucial both in the original Hunger Games book and in the film, in which Peeta and Katniss are coming into awareness of how they are being manipulated. And what Peeta offers is the possibility, maybe we can manipulate that. So if everything that the students in making this trailer could have filmed, everything that they could have tried to reenact, the fact that that is one of the few scenes of conversation that they choose to reenact, to me, speaks a lot about their emerging consciousness, and critical consciousness around how media manipulates, but then how they also have potential power themselves to manipulate that, to participate, to make their own contribution. Now, what I want to do in the remainder of my time, hopefully no more than about 10 minutes, is to talk briefly about a book called Will Grayson, Will Grayson. And I've used this text as a way to kind of think through some of my theses around this tension between a corporate branding of literacy and young people's work with those literacies and attempt to kind of rejigger them, and remix them, and make them do other kinds of things and participate, sometimes in more critically capacious ways. I chose this particular text, not only because it was an extremely influential text when it came out a few years ago. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, frequently assigned in schools. It was written by two people. One, David Levithan, who is himself a very important young adult fiction writer, and also one of the principal editors at the Scholastic Corporation, who shepherded the Hunger Games to its worldwide success. So this is a company man, somebody deeply invested in not only promoting his corporation's particular products, but also is somebody who's extraordinarily smart and savvy, and is certainly not beyond reflecting some of the critique that one can lodge at the Scholastic Corporation. Opposite him is his co-author, John Green, whom I mentioned before. Remember, Nerd Fighters, Decrease World Suck. This is somebody who's extraordinarily invested in helping young people develop their own media literacies, develop their own media technological abilities to create content, to help fight injustice locally wherever they see it. So Green and Levitin, maybe two of the most important people working in young adult fiction today, got together and decided that they would co-author a book. And they switched chapters, going Levitin, first with Green, then to Levitin, Green to Levitin, Green to Levitin. And what they did was create this cast of characters. Each had one primary character, curiously enough, both called Will Grayson. So Levitin creates a Will Grayson character. His Will Grayson never writes in capital letters, always writes in lowercase letters, which reflects that he is a profoundly depressed young man. He also happens to be gay. He's struggling with trying to come out of the closet and be public about his own sexuality and trying to find support for that. And so we see him very much struggling with that narrative throughout all of Levitin's chapters. Green's Will Grayson is a young straight kid who is trying desperately not to be attached to anybody. He has feelings for a young woman named Jane, but is in deep denial of the complexity of those feelings and thinks that his best option is just to kind of play it cool, be detached, etc. His best friend is a very, very large kid called Tiny, who also happens to be gay. And Green and Levitin share this character, although it's originally Green's creation, Tiny is Green's creation. But they eventually come to share that character. So the novel proceeds for half of it with two totally separate stories. Lowercase Will Grayson struggling with his own internalized homophobia and his depression. He is talking to people mostly just online. He develops feelings for this guy online, a guy named Isaac, who is another teenager. So we see several chapters of that. And then we see Green's Will Grayson trying to play it cool, trying to be detached, having to suffer through Tiny, who is this huge character, who also plays on the football team, by the way. I mean, this is just a preposterous character. But Tiny, who is in the midst of writing a musical about his own life that he's going to get his school to stage. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what the musical is called? Tiny Dancer. So, two very different stories. The stories merge halfway through when the characters finally meet. The two Will Graysons meet. And what's interesting about that meeting is that the press for the book suggests that the meeting transforms their lives. And it kind of really doesn't. They meet, and they don't have a whole lot of interaction. But how they meet is interesting. Lowercase Will Grayson, the depressed, internalized homophobe gay kid, travels to Chicago to meet his online love interest, Isaac. Turns out, Isaac is a completely made-up character. No, he's not a 46-year-old pervert. Instead, it's his best female friend who has a crush on him. And the female friend didn't know how to express those feelings. Well, this lowercase Will Grayson is completely devastated. He has been the victim of Facebook fraud. So Will Grayson in Chicago, trying to meet this phantom Isaac, runs into the other Will Grayson, who has come with his friends to an underground indie rock band's performance. And unfortunately, he gets ditched by his friends. They're a complicated series of things, not worth revealing. But in the process, they meet, talk, and kind of begin to share friends. The punchline is that the lowercase Will Grayson becomes friends with Tiny, and they start to date a little bit, but that falls apart ultimately by the end of the book. So why am I picking on this particular story? So I've just given you the thumbnail sketch. I'm going to pick on it for 5 minutes because I think it reveals two very different approaches to understanding literacy and media. And their approaches represented, on one hand, by David Levitin, the representative of the Scholastic Corporation, and on the other hand, by John Green, the representative of DIY participatory culture. The book itself is saturated with multimedia content. Many of the chapters themselves are remediated as IM chats or as Facebook wall posts. So the book itself pays a lot of homage to the fact that young people use a lot of multimedia. The book begins with John Green's Will Grayson writing a letter to the editor of his local student newspaper, kind of supporting Tiny's decision to come out of the closet. He then reflects that that's the biggest mistake of my life because it violates his rule to sort of be disengaged. But it ultimately turns out really, really good for all of these characters. We see how Tiny is dumped on Facebook, and we also see that there is a 7th period class in video game design. Educators will do anything these days. So book immediately begins recognizing a variety of literary acts that young people are engaged in. Levithan's a little bit more complicated. Levithan is extremely hard on institutions of learning of any kind, not just in this book, but in most of his books. He calls them fine institutions of lower learning, characterized by blinded statement to standardized tests. He's not totally wrong there. But we find out that Will Grayson, small WG, can't imagine why anyone would be a teacher. They're all sadists and losers. We see a lot of Will Grayson waiting for Isaac on the buddy list, and he just has all of these riffs. New media, it's all for losers, right? Look how they talk, LOL, TTYL, ROFL, you know? It's just, I have to get rid of my IM account to avoid my friends because they keep bugging me. Stan, penis enlargement, Facebook friending, it's all just a mess. What is good? Well, S.E. Hinton. Again, maybe not surprising that the book editor would want to promote. Don't look at all of this stuff, right? Back to Green. Green, and I can imagine that the two authors wrote this book. In fact, we know how they wrote it. Green would write a chapter, send it to Levithan, Levithan would write a chapter, and they'd go back and forth, back and forth. So by the 3rd chapter, Green's 2nd chapter, he's already curiously firing back, suggesting that, well, you know, maybe this Facebook media, multimedia is not so bad. And it's almost as though he's staging a discussion with Levithan throughout the book. And he offers increasing examples of how multimedia, interactive media is actually very useful for young people. And at times it can be ironic or sarcastic, but he recognizes it as an important part of teens' life. And I can't help but think that he's firing back against Levithan. And you can track this entire conversation where what happens with Isaac is, of course, this is an instance of internet fraud, right? Whereas Green often shows steadily more and more how people engaged with media literate practices are able to connect with their friends, to share values. There are a lot of other aspects of this that I could talk about. Levithan, as he gets to know, as Will Grayson gets to know Tiny, again, rants and rails against even the text messages that they share, because even the text messages that they share don't really give him a strong sense of who Tiny is as a person, whereas subsequent chapters by John Green, his Will Grayson, primarily gets to know his friends and understands them better and has closer communication via the text messaging that they do. And it goes back and forth, as though the two authors are staging a debate. By the time we get to the production of Tiny Dancer, and this is the apotheosis of the entire book, Isaac has been revealed as a fraud. Tiny is going to be creating this musical to celebrate his life, celebrate how he's able to come out, survive 17 disastrous relationships with the different boyfriends, but is still an interesting and viable character and personality. And the whole goal, the whole purpose of the book seems to be moving towards the staging of this musical. But then it's as though what Green is doing is helping young people who are reading this book understand that they can create, that they can imagine what it would be like to produce, not just a musical, but to create media that could then be attractive and engaging, that could bring people together. And so all of Levithan's characters and their abuse, in some ways, their victimization by media, is countered increasingly by Green, and this way of thinking about media is increasingly important in people's lives, but not just important, something they can use, something they can create. It's a little crazy. It's hard to imagine a 16-year-old, very large, football-playing gay kid corralling an entire school together, writing his own musical, which undergoes, as a good writing instructor, is pleased to know that this undergoes multiple revisions, is peer-reviewed, and yet it's this massive musical. It's this huge production. He writes all of the lyrics, writes all of his own songs, choreographs the entire thing, gets everybody together to produce this, and, as he says, it must be about something even more fabulous, love, the polychromatic many splintered the Dreamcoat of Love in all its myriad glories, and so it had to be revised, also retitled, and so I had to stay up all night, and I've been writing like crazy, writing a musical called Now Hold Me Closer. We'll need more sets than I thought. Also, more voices on the chorus. The chorus must be like a fucking wall of sound, you know. And so that the student actually can envision pulling this off. It maybe stretches the bounds of credulity. What happens in the final pages of the novel is that the lowercase Will Grayson wants to help his friend, Tiny now, create this musical, but also create a community in which people are appreciating what Tiny has done. So they use Google and they look up everybody else in the city of Chicago who is called Will Grayson, and they invite them all to the first performance of this musical. And the entire thing ends in the apotheosis of self-acceptance, acceptance of the other. It's not just a musical, it's a collective cheering for people having come together through their own media practices, through technology, and connected together. That's Green's ultimate vision. It's nearly this utopic sense of people coming together, even who don't know each other, to help affirm, to give support, to be there for one another, and to create community. It sounds a lot like a fantasy, and I couldn't help but think of if any of you have seen this. And Glee often stages again and again and again all of these moments in which young people are miraculously coming together, having practiced not at all, to produce lavish. I don't know about you, my high school did not have its own string orchestra just hanging out, waiting to accompany when I felt like going into song. And I couldn't help but think as I got to the end of this book, and its gleeful kind of apotheosis, its utopic sensibility, that we are ultimately offering, even against our best efforts, or with our best efforts, we're ultimately offering some potentially unsustainable ways of thinking about media literacy. On one hand, this constant branding of media is potentially dangerous that we get through the Hunger Games, and the sense that we are just purveyors of information. That seems completely insufficient to helping people navigate all of the multimedia that they're going to have to. But then again, conversely, these images, these Glee images that come to permeate and saturate Green's vision of a technologically induced utopia, seem also themselves hyperbolically out of reach and simply fantastical. So, I don't want to leave you with that sort of awfulness, except to say that I think the challenge of working with media right now, working with multimedia literacies, is simultaneously to attune our students to the ways in which they are being positioned, and their media literacy practices are being positioned in ways that maybe aren't productive for them, that scare them away from contributing, that don't allow them to have much of a foothold or a digital print in media interactions or platforms of communication. And that then conversely, we shouldn't bite off more than we can chew, that perhaps inviting students to consider how multimedia can transform the world might be premature, that media enactments might need to be a little more modest. And in fact, there are many ways in which people can successfully and productively use media to make their world a somewhat better place, a world less full of suck. So at that, I will pause. There's much more I could say, but I invite your questions, and I thank you for your patience. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Hi, I was struck by the similarity between the nerd fighting slogan about making the world more awesome and less full of suck, and Google's slogan of "Don't be evil." And I'm kind of wondering. I mean, and the Nerd Fighter was definitely set up as this sort of techno optimism, and Scholastic was set up as this more. Well, I'm not sure, like a consumerist. I mean, they certainly seem to have their techno-optimistic moments in the way they're marketing their books. And these were sort of set up as sort of two sides of a continuum, maybe, and I'm wondering if maybe they don't collapse together a little more than that presentation
That
might
narrating them, yeah.
originally lead us to believe.
Well, in fact, what I'm trying to do in looking at the Levitin and Green book, Will Grayson, Will Grayson, is show some of that collapse in some ways. In that, I think what happens is that in Green trying to counter Levitin's vision, he counters it so hyperbolically that the goal of the media literate practice is itself just completely unattainable. And so and that may not be precisely what you're getting at. You're wanting to suggest, I think, that something like Nerd Fighters is maybe on that same continuum with Google's, Don't Be Evil campaign. I might argue that I think Google took that campaign in part from Nerd Fighters, which itself was a much more homegrown vision.
I guess
so it's more of a kind of co-optation of the digital counterculture.
I guess I'm also wondering if you have a slogan that is that sort of open to not just interpretation, but it's sort of meaningless.
Yeah.
Whether that sort of leaves one vulnerable to like any sort of hidden ideology or consumerist bent that might just be floating in the culture. I mean, if they say like make the world less suck, what do you mean by less suck?
What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of means what we all agree less suck means, which is exactly what the powers that be agree that less suck means, which means suck.
That's a very good question. What I would encourage you to do, if you want to know more specifically about the Greens and their platform, and they do have a platform, it's very liberal. It's even progressivist. In fact, it's sometimes just downright socialist in its orientation. And so I would argue that their particular vision for Nerd Fighters, while it's capacious and large, right? Their videos, and they're active content generators themselves. They're constantly doing their own videos. Are really all about economic injustice and how do we understand systems of economic injustice and how do we potentially fight them. And it is very pointed in that direction. And so I think that they're invitational in that they're not insisting that young people who post to their site toe that particular party line, but certainly they are creating an ambiance, I would argue, the artists of pretty progressivist mindsets, or it's easy to kind of adopt that mindset. So that would be how they're trying to do their work. They started this because they actually each realized that the two brothers weren't really talking to one another very much. And so they decided, we're just in these text messages. What does it mean to text message? So they decided they could actually create a blog or a video blog that they would contribute to every week. And they found themselves not just staying in better touch, but actually themselves starting to agitate and turn to activist orientation around a number of things that they were concerned about. And so they themselves